es lebt und seine Kraft mich hebt.
Welcome to the Mennonite Heritage Archives in Winnipeg, Manitoba. My name is Conrad Stoesz and I'm the archivist here. We've been collecting the Mennonite story since 1933. We're situated here on the campus of Canadian Mennonite University, and we're the official archive for Mennonite Church Canada and other Mennonite denominations and organizations. Our materials span from the 1600s to the present. Our focus has been on collecting the Mennonite experience in Poland, Prussia, Russia, Canada, and Latin America. We have 4 partners: Mennonite Church Canada, Canadian Mennonite University, the Centre for Transnational Mennonite Studies, and you. You are also part of our community archive. We are a community archive. We collect the story about the Mennonite experience so it can be used later on. When I meet people and they ask me, so what do you do for a living? And I tell them, well, I'm an archivist. I usually get a blank stare, or they say, an archive what? What do you do in an archive? You just dust books all day? There's not a good understanding of archives and archivists in society. Archives is a memory institution. It collects materials for our community and collects the memory of the community for later use. There are other memory institutions like libraries and museums, and those institutions we're more familiar with. You go to a museum and you know what to expect. There'll be things on display, objects on display, there'll be panels to read, and you can wander around and look and read and learn about what that museum has to offer. Libraries is another memory institution. And we're familiar with libraries. We have libraries in our communities, we have libraries in our churches, we even have home libraries. But archives are a little bit different. When I ask people how many people have been to an archive, maybe a third of the people can say, yeah, they've been to an archive, but most people haven't. And so archives are not well known. And so how to do research in an archive is different than in a library, and people don't quite understand that. So I want to talk a little bit about how research is different in an archive because of the kinds of materials we collect. Archives, we focus on collecting original material, one-of-a-kind documents. The only place in the world where these documents exist and live is in an archive, and so that's one reason why archives are different. In a library, if a book goes missing, many cases, especially with modern books, you can get another one because the book has been reproduced. There's many hundreds, if not thousands, of copies of a book. But in an archive, it's not the same. How we access information in a library and an archive is different. In a library, books are categorized and grouped together. If you want to see all the cookbooks, you know if you find out where one cookbook is, all the other cookbooks will be on the same place on the shelf. But archives is not quite the same. Libraries and books use technologies that archives don't have. So, for example, here you have some books. There is a title on these books. Not all archival documents have titles. The books are in print. There are chapter headings. There's a table of contents. There's a bibliography, footnotes, index. All these things, these technologies help the author and the book convey what the author wants the reader to know. But yet, in archives, it's not quite the same. We don't have time to read and index everything. In our little archive, if you stack all the paper on top of each other, it's over 600 meters, higher than the CN Tower. We don't have time to index everything. So how do we find ways of finding things? Archivists spend a lot of time creating contextual knowledge. We create context around the documents to help researchers find what they're looking for. So archivists work at creating contextual information. So context is important to understand the document, to interpret the documents. So what if I told you a message went from Athens to Greece and it took one day, 24 hours? Would you say that's fast or slow? You can't really give me an answer, can you? Because you don't have enough contextual information. You don't know if this is in the year 200 or 2000. You don't know if this message is being sent by person on foot, person on a horse, by the mail, by phone, by text, email. Those are contextual clues that help you determine, to help you evaluate if this message was sent was arrived fast or slow. So that context is very important. Now here I have an interesting document. It's a photograph. Now I have a love-hate relationship with this photograph. It's a real pain to store because it's so big. But the photograph is really cool, and I kind of like it. You'll see that there's plastic on here, so this is a low-tech way of preserving the document, the photograph. This is inert plastic. That's what we call encapsulate. And there's double-sided tape on the outsides, so it doesn't touch the document, the photograph. I can undo this if I need to, so it's not lamination. But this document is interesting. The people, if you look at the faces of the people in this photograph, you'll realize that they are crystal clear. It's a very clear photograph. When I ask people, so how did they make this photograph? People ask, well, maybe they took several pictures and spliced it together. Well, you look closely, that's not the case. So how did they do this? Sometimes when people are very familiar with cameras and smartphones, they say, oh, jokingly, well, you stand in the middle and you put the people in a circle and then you pan around. And they're amazed when I said, yeah, exactly. This picture taken in 1923 used a very unique technology. They had a camera on a tripod. Everyone was seated in a circle around the camera, so really they're not that far from the camera. The photographer wound up a spring on the camera, and the camera then panned the entire circle. And that's how you get such crystal clear pictures, because these people really are not that far from the camera. So what does this have to do with context? Well, if you want a picture of Grandpa who was in this picture, that's great. But what if you wanted to know something about the yard where this picture was taken? Something about this house, for example. You have to understand the technology in order to interpret this picture. This context is important, because right now this house here, where my thumb is, and this pole look like they're far apart. But in reality, they're close together. So the contextual information, the archivist's contextual information they provided this photograph includes information about the technology used to make this photograph, which helps the researcher interpret the photograph. So as archivists, we create this contextual information, and we put that information in what we call finding aids, tools that help researchers locate the materials that we're looking for, like this one here. So this is the finding aid for Michael Clausen. Now, if a person wanted to do research about the Spanish flu of 1918 or a Mennonite courting or something like that, we don't have that in a box in those topics on the shelf. But you have to find that information within the contextual information in the finding aid. So here we have Michael Clausen's family collection. And we have information about historical note about who Michael Clausen was, and information about the family, where they moved to, when he was born, when he died. And we find that this information also includes information on Michael Clausen, Michael Clausen's father, Martin Clausen. Martin Clausen was an artist who lived in Prussia. So this is a village shot of Tegenhagen, of where Martin Clausen lived, Tegenhagen, Prussia. You can see the very flat landscape. You can see the red roofed houses in the background, the cattle grazing, the grain over here, the windmill, even a ship out there in full sail. This was done in 1871. So from the finding aid, we'll learn that Michael Clausen was a son of Martin Clausen. Martin Clausen lived in Prussia and later moved to Russia. And the family later moved to the United States. And the finding aid will tell you that Michael Clausen's son, the grandson of Martin Clausen, Johannes, was a conscientious objector in World War I in the United States. And the United States government put him in prison. They wanted him to fight in the war, and he decided no, he wanted to be a conscientious objector. But they put him in prison. And in prison, he wrote letters. And so this finding aid lists all the letters that are in this collection, including the ones from Johannes while he's in prison. And Johannes dies of the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu from 100 years ago, 1918 to 1919. And so this finding aid lists all these letters and that you will find in this collection here. So you'll notice here this volume numbers. These are box numbers. And they're not all together because this material has come in at different times. But we keep the materials together in this finding aid. Now look at this over here. Volume 3477, Martin Clausen Diary, 1852 to 1870. Let's go take a look at it. So here I have the box with Martin Clausen's diary. You see the box number here, 3477. You can take a look inside here. And then the diary is written in Gothic script. So it's a language or a way of writing the letters that a lot of people can't read nowadays, even if they know German. You can see it's pretty beat up. Well, it's seen a lot of use and a lot of miles. The entries, there's a lot of writing for the entries. And so Martin is using this diary as a confidant. He's putting in a lot of information. There's different ways of using a diary. Some people use a diary just for recording facts or everyday events. Other people use a diary as a confidant, like their best friend, a way of pouring out their innermost feelings. So Martin is using the diary in that genre, as using the diary to explain his feelings. The other things that are unique about this diary is interesting to note, as you can see here, that pages that had writing on it have been cut out. Other places in the diary have a black mark that going over the text. So luckily, this diary has been translated into English. Esther Bergen of Winnipeg, a granddaughter of Martin Clausen, set to it to translate this piece. She knew the German language, she knew the Gothic script, and she loved puzzles. So I'm going to read a little bit from the translation. So here we have a different box number, Martin Clausen. So in 1853, May the 16th, Martin writes, "My future is dark as it ever has been. No friendly ray of light or star of hope breaks through this complete darkness. My innermost conviction says Russia is the land of your future destiny. Therefore, you must not stay here." I kind of wonder, like, what is holding Martin back? Like, his family wants to move from Prussia to Russia, but he's not feeling very secure about this. But then you'll also notice in here in the diary, there are places that are written in letters that I don't recognize. They're not English, they're not German. Martin is writing in code. He's writing in code. And yet there's pages that are cut out of here. There's places where black marker is over the text. And yet there's places where code is still in here. So what does this code say? The curiosity of Esther got the better of her, and she set to it to crack this code. So, to read further, Martin writes, still on May the 16th, "But my heart does not want to hear this. The experiences of the recent past have cast shackles around its very core, whose removal would leave wounds never to be healed. It is possible that another heart would break as a result." Then on the 17th of May, he writes, and this part is in code, "O my Renata, who knows how soon our hour will come, when we will forever separate, oh, never to see each other again." Martin's in love with a woman. Then we move down the page to the entry on May the 22nd. There's another section in code. He writes, "My dearly beloved Renata, O God, is it possible? What wonderful hours we have spent together. Only today, how intimately she hung on my arm during the service in the Catholic Church. Oh, she calls me her own. Martin is in love with a woman from the Catholic Church. His family is leaving, his Mennonite family is leaving to join the Mennonites in Russia. But yet he is held back by this love with a Catholic woman. That's why he's struggling so hard. Thanks to Martin for writing, thanks to Esther for cracking the code, we now can read this information and feel a closer connection to Martin and some of his struggles. Esther's curiosity got the better of her, but she wondered, well, should I really be cracking this code? Should I be trying to read Grandpa's diary? And Esther admits that when I meet him someday, I'll have to make amends. So in our little archive, we have a lot of material, and a host of different people use this material for different purposes. They use it for legal purposes, they use it for making a documentary, a TV show, family histories, commemoration, anniversaries, all kinds of different material are used for different purposes. And Andrew Wahl is a film producer, and he's used some of this material for his documentary, Volendam. And we're going to interview him. So today I'm talking with Andrew Wahl, documentary film producer, based here in Winnipeg, and his company is called Refuge 31. Can you talk a little bit about the role of archives in producing these documentaries?
Invaluable. I'm a bit of an archive rat, and I think when we presented it at the Human Rights Museum, I talked about how documentary makers are kind of like thieves that sort of sneak in and take the most precious things, and that's what archives do. They collect all this material, and sometimes there's some amazing nuggets that everything else supports. And so for me, I've kind of developed a fascination with Mennonite history and kind of found a relevance to it. It's not just that thing that when I was growing up, I knew a little bit about from my grandparents or parents, or that I sat through in Mennonite studies, but actually to see there's some really fascinating chapters, and that we can go into the archives and find a piece of film that correlates, or find, a photograph or an article or a picture or a file that helps support these stories. Sometimes you find those amazing little nuggets that bring it alive.
So in the creation of Volendam, hold it over here. Tell me how you got interested in the story.
It really was Otto Claessen's story, telling Otto Claessen's story. He was on Volendam. And so for context, Otto Claessen, we did a 45-minute CBC short film about Otto, who had lived an incredible life. It's almost hard to believe what he went through and the events that happened in his life. And he was on Volendam, and he made it to Paraguay. And because of that, I started digging up some film materials to support it. And I had always had these film reels from my great-grandfather, C.A. de Fer. I had copies that had ended up in my possession. I didn't really know what they were, other than some of it was family, some of it was business. And I knew there was one, though, in Paraguay. So suddenly, by telling Otto Claessen's story, I suddenly had some relevance to this film reel that was labeled Paraguay. Unfortunately, most of it had been borrowed over the years. We don't know when it disappeared, probably in the 80s. So we went on this hunt to try to find that. And that combined with, I'd seen Peter Dick telling the story of the Berlin Exodus, and that was filmed in the 80s. And that was online all of a sudden. I don't think it's online anymore. So for an hour, Peter Dick condenses his side of his sort of take on it. And I just said, we need to go back and we need to tell the Ukrainian Stalin story leading up to it. And we need to take all these film pieces. There was 3 different filmmakers. Peter Dick was filming back in the 40s during this whole Volendam story. We had C.F. Claessen, and then we had C.A. de Fer. And for some reason, these 3 guys had film cameras. And bits of them are being digitized. I think some of it has been lost over time. But for the most part, I think we found as much as we could to tell the story. And so that to me was like that we could find these bits in the archives, and I had some personally. That's a story you got to tell. And it was also really important to me to give personal side of the refugees, the Mennonites that had lived through it. Many of them were children at the time, or young adults.
So what was it like actually finding your great-grandpa's film footage?
Yeah, the missing Paraguay reel, we found bits of it in your archives. It had been copied over the years. I found parts of it in MCC archives. You can always see pieces of these three different cameramen. Peter Dick made a short 20-minute documentary where he just narrates it of some of the footage. You can see C.A. DeFer's footage in there, and so there was clues everywhere. But Otto Clausen actually had a copy of that reel, and there was bits of it. And Otto Clausen, just to give context, he was a filmmaker. He was a stonemason, but he also made films on the side during the, I guess, 80s and 90s. And so he had all this film footage, and there was bits of it in his collection. And he also had a reel titled "Fallen Down." That was just sort of the Soviet story, a little bit of the Soviet story, Fallen Down story, and the Paraguay story. It was just sort of like a loose timeline of bits and pieces, no narration, no continuous story. So I think Otto Clausen at one point maybe had tried or thought about telling the story. And so that's where it all came together. And then I finally found bits of my great-grandfather's Paraguay film reels in his collection, kind of his rough cuts, everything that was sort of dumped onto the bin. And who knows, maybe someday I'll find the full reel.
Can you give a synopsis of what Fallen Down is about?
Yeah, it's the Mennonite story, and we sort of start off in Russia, giving it a little bit of historical context. It's 80 plus minutes, and I would have loved to have spent an hour talking about the Mennonites leading up to Russia. But it starts off in Russia, and then we move through the process of the Soviet or the Russian Revolution, and then the Soviets taking over. And we, at that point, when Stalin takes over, we jump in where many of our subjects actually had memories from the late 30s. Some of them were able to tell their parents' memories who were long past, and guiding through this terrible tragedy of not immigrating and then staying and enduring Stalin. And then, of course, the Germans show up, when the Nazis invade, and sort of this crazy world of you have the German invaders are actually liberating you, and sort of existing in that sort of dualistic world of Nazis being your freedom, giving you your freedom, and then of course when that all falls apart, trying to escape Europe and escape Stalin again.
Andrew Wahl is a great friend of the archives, so he's allowing the archives to be the distributor of the Fallen Down. So if you want your copy, you can contact us at info@mharchives.ca. That was Andrew Wahl, film producer here in Winnipeg, talking to him via Zoom about his new documentary called Fallen Down. Documentary film producers are one kind of people who use the archives. They use the archives for their projects, which then rest of society gets to benefit from and watch, in this case, a documentary. So everyone benefits from the archives through the documentary. Sometimes people ask me, well, what is the most important document you have in the archive? And I usually turn to this box right here. This box contains the letter of invitation from the Canadian government to the Mennonites of South Russia. The document dated 1873. Because this document was so important, we had this document restored. The Canadian Conservation Institute in Ottawa took this document. There was tape on here, it was ripped, it was dirty, and so the CCI, Canadian Conservation Institute, took this document, they tested it, they tested the ink and the paper to make sure that they had the right washing techniques in place, because this is iron gall ink they found, and they found there was high levels of mold on the document, and they washed it, they cleaned it, and they repaired it, and they did a great job. And it's not that surprising that the document was in rough shape. It's crossed the ocean twice and is over 125 years old. This document invites the Mennonites to come to Manitoba. Without this document, the Mennonites would not have come to Western Canada. They probably would have stayed in Russia or have gone to the United States. So this is the reason, this document is the reason why Mennonites are in Western Canada. The document outlines promises that the government gives to the Mennonites. The government wanted farmers in Western Canada. So after Treaty 1 was signed, they promised Mennonites land that they could farm. They also promised them their own schools and their own freedom of religion and exemption from military service. So this is the English version of the document. This here is, of course, the German version. There's 15 points in here. So this document is important to understand why Mennonites came to Canada, but it's also important to understand why there's Mennonites in Mexico and parts of Latin America. Point number 10 promises that the Mennonites will have the freedom of education. They can educate their children as they wish. They won't be bothered. But in the context of World War I, the Manitoba and Saskatchewan governments enacted school legislation that forced public schools onto the population. So that meant that boys and girls between the ages of 7 and 14 had to go to school. And not just any school, they had to go to a government school because the government wanted to instill government priorities, government values into these students. Some Mennonite groups really reacted strongly to this. They did not want this at all. Other Mennonite groups said, well, we can find other ways of instilling values into our children. We'll do that through Sunday schools or through school boards, that type of thing. But some Mennonites said, no, education is so important. Education is the responsibility of the church and the family. It's not the responsibility of the state. So they refused to send their children to these public schools. And they sent their kids to the private schools, the private Mennonite schools, where they learned German and the catechism. But the government forged on with this process. Kids that didn't go to school, their parents were fined, they were imprisoned, even had their farming equipment confiscated. Their horses, their equipment, even the hams that they were smoking for the winter were confiscated, all in an attempt to force the Mennonites to educate their children in the public school system. Between 1914 and about 1925, there were over 5,000 prosecutions in Saskatchewan alone. And some of the Mennonites were destitute. They were so poor. And so they decided to look for a place to move. Canada was not the place that they thought it was. The government was not abiding by its promises. The matter went to court, and the Mennonites were amazed to find out that, well, education was a provincial matter. It's not a federal matter. So this promise, this document from 1873 didn't hold water in the courts because education was provincial, not federal. So between 1922 and 1927, about 7,000 Mennonites left for Mexico and Paraguay. That's why this document is so important. It explains Mennonites coming to Manitoba, but also Mennonites in South and Latin America. So our archive is full of stories. And stories are important. They are funny, they're sad, they're filled with grief and happiness. They're instructive, and stories have power to influence our actions. I'm reminded of 2004. It was December the 26th, and I was riding in the back of my in-laws' van on the way back from a family gathering. And there was some kind of news happening about something happening in Southeast Asia. And it was the big tsunami that killed thousands and thousands of people. The earth shook, the water moved out, came back and killed thousands of people. But there was one story that was unique in that episode that I found instructive. It was from the island of Simeulue, Indonesia. Simeulue, Indonesia was the first piece of land that these waves hit. And when the reporters were sent out, they went to Simeulue expecting to find a lot of death and destruction. And when they got there, they found a lot of destruction. But of a population of 75,000 people, only 7 people died. 7. Why 7 there when other places thousands and thousands of people died? The reporters went and talked to the people of Simeulue, and they said that 100 years ago, there was another tsunami. The earth shook, and the water moved back, came back and killed a lot of their people. So they've been telling their children and grandchildren over and over again that when the earth shakes and water moves out, you head to higher ground. In 2004, the people of Simeulue were saved because they remembered their story. Stories have power. Stories have the power to influence us. And we're surrounded by stories. Our news feeds, our television, our Instagram, Facebook all have stories. But the stories from our collective past, in our archive, our memory institution, can also instruct us on how to live. Thanks for joining me. I'm Conrad Stoesz, and I'm here at the Mennonite Heritage Archives in Winnipeg.
Ganz gewiss, das ist mein